Hey, everybody, welcome. So, today we're talking about a topic that often some people can feel a little allergic to, which is music theory, just because we have this preconceived notion that it's maybe a little dry and sort of like mathematical and things like that. Uh, but hopefully, this is a good chance for me to answer any questions that you might have about it, because really we want to just think of music theory as a way to understand a language, right? It's like our grammar, understanding the meaning of certain things so that we can better communicate with each other. It's important to note that, music theory kind of came after the fact. Like playing music and singing is sort of a natural kind of primitive thing that we do. And theory is just like a way to start to understand and categorize things so that we can better communicate and reproduce things, so that it actually makes everything easier for us. And it's when you understand music theory, you can interact with other musicians better. And so I'm just going to go through the process, because a lot of the times, like when we're working as musicians, especially as vocalists, we sort of get like thrown right into the middle of everything, and you have a lot of holes often, right, in terms of your understanding. Hey, welcome, good to see you. um, so oftentimes I get students where they know little bits and pieces, but they haven't really put it together into a system. And there's some things that we like kind of take for granted that I think is really important. And so when I help people understand the sort of context of music theory, all of a sudden it starts to make more sense, and it doesn't just feel like little random bits of information. And then sometimes, the challenge, right, of understanding music theory is if you crack open a textbook, it looks highly technical. You're often going to get like a lot of symbols. And if you don't understand the context of the symbols, it just looks like jargon, right? It's like a bunch of random information. I mean, they're often very well put together, but it's just hard to kind of dig into that. It looks like mathematical, and I think it's better to understand it from uh, just from a broader perspective first. And then that actually makes those books a little bit easier to understand. And oftentimes, when we learn theory, we have a teacher guiding us through those kind of textbook like materials that we have. Um, yeah, exactly, exactly. There's all these old terms. They're often in like a different language, like Italian, French, German, and of course we have some things that are just English as well. But it just makes for a lot of complexity, right? And it's understanding what someone is trying to ask. And so please, like in this lesson, like ask me questions. I want to fill in some of those gaps. I'm also going to go through music theory in a very sort of like slow, methodical way, just so we have a really clear understanding of what we're going for. And again, just remember there's an intuitive part to music where we can discover these things by feeling them out, by playing notes. And oftentimes that's what happens, right? We're thrown into it and we start learning skills before we really even understand the context, because, it's pretty dry if you want to just like start someone with that before you have any sense of like playing music or any of your technical skills. So this actually hopefully will make things easier, and I think it's really, really cool and interesting. Now, it's important to note there's like physics, that's like understanding like sound waves and all the acoustics and those kinds of things, and sometimes we deal with that, right, when we talk about singing and understanding acoustics. uh, that's like the undercurrent of a lot of these things in music theory. But music theory is particularly how do we organize and better communicate, or how do we organize all the sounds that we have and better communicate what we're doing, so that we can remember it and then other people can remember it as well. And we can pass it along, right? So think of it as like the written word, right? We want to pass information along, so we have to sort of document it. And music theory has gone through some iterations, right? It's gone through some different systems. And again, we're talking about Western classical music theory. There's some particularities to some other cultures as well. And just to point out, that's like sort of what we're specifically going into. It is a universal language, but throughout history, people have come up with slightly different systems and ways to try and document it. And some of those have fallen away over time because they're not as applicable, or they feel like too complex. There's too much information on the page, disorienting. So a lot of times when we're dealing with like written sheet music, it's important to note that it looks the way that it does because we're trying to fit a lot of information in a way that looks elegant and is visual, so that you can perceive it sort of as you're going, rather than really slow down. And yes, we can do that and analyze music that way, but it's written for the practice of performing and all these other things. So there has to be a certain efficiency and to the shapes, and we're also trying to save like ink and paper, right? Like back in the day, these things cost money and they were harder to come by, and so there's these different systems, and sometimes they were like color coded, and there were certain things that weren't added in based on the context of the music, like a clear rhythmic structure and things like that. Hi, welcome. So hopefully this will just help give you a good starting point. And if you're someone who's already been doing this for a while, it's just a way to be very thorough. And if you're someone who's a teacher, that first time where people start asking me questions about like, why is it this way? And it's actually kind of a little tricky sometimes to explain. So hopefully this will give you a context that I like to use. So the first thing to understand is we have a way to document our individual notes. So I know it sounds like really silly, but what is a note, right? It's a particular frequency. And we want to make sure that we have labels for all of these notes. And if back in the day, what people did was divide up lengths of strings, and start to get a sense of what's the relationship between these different lengths of strings or lengths of a tube or things like that. And that's kind of like the physics side of it. And what's the relationship to them? And then how many times can I divide up those lengths of strings, and how can I organize them? And just understand that music and frequencies, it's a kind of like a relative system in the sense that we could divide things up like kind of infinitely if you want to think about like what's a wave versus like these individual sort of moments. And so it's just important to note that there's a practicality to some of it. And you'll look at some other cultures and there's like microtonal divisions and things like that, because you can actually continue to divide things up. When we're talking about like in between pitches, we often use this term cents. And the cents are these small divisions. And the question is like, what can our ear actually even pick up on in terms of changes? And there's a limit to what our ear can actually sort of perceive. It's around like 7 to 10 cents. And so it's just important to note that like we have some physical limitations, even though like theoretically, right, we could just continue to divide up notes to these smaller and smaller sort of sub fractions of each other. So one thing that's really important to note and sort of explains why we have letters that we use to name our notes, and this sort of repeating cycle of letters, is this sort of primitive understanding that I think is really important as your foundation, which is that notes that are double or half the frequency kind of sound similar to our ear because, again, sort of the way the physics works, they don't really sort of conflict with each other as much. They fit within sort of like, if you've ever seen the sort of like wave-like kind of sign pattern, right? They fit within each other and they don't create distortion, right? So whenever I talk about like ear training skills and listening to like beats and distortion against waves as you fall out of tune and then come right back into matching in unison with something, these are like physical forces. And what we hear is like when we do things that are in these ratios of 2 to 1, so half or double, they sound similar. And so that's just like this intuitive sort of primitive thing. But I think it's really important to actually address because it's like, why do we have these letters repeating over and over again? It's because like if I play a C here, and I play something an octave higher or double the frequency or twice the length or half the length of the string, in this case, half the length, they sound like they fit together, right? So I think of it kind of like water or something, right? It's very clear. Whereas if I play something that's not in that ratio, they start to interact or they start to create these particular sort of distortions in these ratios. So that's why we have letters repeating over and over again. So that's like the first thing to understand. And it goes from A to G. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G. right? We have 7 spots, and then we'll talk about sort of half steps and subdivisions and things like that. But we have 7 main letters that we use, and then it repeats over and over again. It's because of this concept of pitch class, or the fact that certain pitches sound similar when they're in that ratio. So if you're playing any frequency or have a length of a string and you half that length of string or double that length of string, we give it the same letter name, and it because it sounds similar. And then comes this question of how can we divide up the notes between that octave, right? And so that's where we get like our, modern day concept of all the half steps, right? So if I go from C to C and I play every note on the piano, which is a nice way, the piano is a nice way to think about all of this because it's very linear and it's sort of set up with this model in mind. So just understand, like when we're talking about theory, like there's this, thousands of years of history of people trying to understand how to categorize notes, and then we have these instruments that are built with that in mind, and we can use that to kind of reverse engineer and understand things about music theory. That's why sometimes we just throw people in to like try playing this, and then you start to make a sense out of like the way that they all interact with each other, right? So one great thing is just to like play things and explore what you pick up an instrument and just see what happens, even if it's a little chaotic. Start to see if you notice things, right? Like when I play one note compared to another, like what sort of effect does it have, right? That's someone starting to be like, I wonder if there's a theory behind all of this. So if I play all the notes from C to C, right? These are all the subdivisions or all the ways that we can divide up our octave. And so it's just essentially like how many times can we divide things up and how can we do it in an even way? So going back to that concept of cents, like 100 cents per half step or half tone, is kind of what we're going for. And this is, again, a particular style of tuning, and there's all sorts of complexities that come to that. If you have questions about it, ask me, but we'll get into that maybe another time. But essentially, like these are all the ways that we can evenly divide up all the notes in between those octaves before we come back to a note that's double the frequency or half the frequency. So that's just to understand like the context. So when we're naming notes, which are positions that we can play or sing, right? These are our options that we have in music. Besides from like bending and microtonal and all these other kinds of things, right? These are our targets, right? And we have to figure out, okay, what on the page is it telling me? Like, what targets do I need to hit? And the cool thing is because we have these letters set up with particular frequencies in a particular kind of tuning, if someone else sees those notes and sings them, they'll be the same, right? So we can reproduce it. So it's just like a nice language that we're using to understand things. Otherwise, you would just, it would have to be like through ear and word of mouth. And that does, there's a lot of skills that initially were like ear-based skills and kind of passed down in this legacy until we could start to make this more universally understood. So the concept here is a note, right, is we use letters for it, and essentially goes from A to G and then repeats over and over again. And then we also have these concepts of sharps and flats, which are some of these in-between notes that we'll talk about. So I like to kind of say like the cardinal letters, right? Like our, just regular A, regular G. And then we're going to talk about why are there sharps and flats and things like that. But if you're naming a note, when I have like a beginning student in any instrument, one of the first things I want to do is just show them that they can understand naming every single note on that instrument, actually. And it's not as crazy or hard as you would think once you understand where one of them is, right? They're in, especially on the piano, right? They're in order. Or if you're thinking about like a stringed instrument, once you figure out the way that it's tuned, which string is what letter, you can figure out all the other ones too. So that's the first thing. And then an easy way to think about sharps and flats is kind of like a way of spelling, is anytime you go up one half step from a letter or down one half step, you can think of it as up a half step being a sharp, so C to C sharp, and even the other way around. And we'll talk about why there are some notes that have only a half step difference. But even just theoretically understanding sort of this practice is like if I go C and I go down a half step, I can also call that C flat. So it's a kind of way of orienting yourself, right? Like, where is that spot? And then we can learn to match those pitches as singers, right? Once we know where the letters are, we can match them. Now, that's a way of doing things, but it's a little complicated actually. And we have other systems that help make this easier, so that we don't just have to memorize all the notes and things like that. So that's the first thing. So a single target. Then we start to talk about intervals. And this is where we have different symbols. And so part of it is like we use numbers and letters because we just need different and sharps and flats and all these things, different symbols to explain different relationships and things, right? So once we know how to name notes with letters and sharps and flats, then we have to start to figure out the distance between one note and the other. Because if you play a note on one side, like from C to G, going up, or you play a G on the other side, C to G, the space or the interval is actually different. And so we have to have a different symbol for this. And please stop me and ask questions. I have my sort of procedure that I'm going to explain through is like our theory 101. But if there's anything like where you're like, hold up, what are you saying? I would love to try and continue to explain it in a way that makes better sense to you as well. So, there's lots of different approaches to this process. This is a very linear approach. So when we're dealing with intervals, which is essentially the space between any two notes that I play. So one thing is a note, then you play two notes, and there's going to be a distance between them. And that's what we mean by an interval, essentially. Now, this is kind of a funny thing to think about. But we use numbers for this, right? So we have letters for naming our notes, and then we have numbers for our intervals. But we also use this other thing, major and minor. And this is going to explain some confusing things that I think I notice and see, because we have to be careful about, eventually we start using numbers for other things too, and we have to be careful about what we're actually talking about. And this is just because we, have some limitations, like, perhaps we could use colors or other things, but or different symbols, right? But this is actually a very smooth way of doing this process. When we're talking about major and minor, something that just demystifies that term, think of just major as above or higher and minor as below or lower. And so it's just helping us understand that there are these different positions of something slightly higher or slightly lower. And this is where we start to also understand some of these half steps or accidental notes like sharps and flats and things like that. So it's just like in medicine, it's the same thing, or like with anatomy, right? Like you have your majorum or your minorum, right? One is above and the other is below. And so it's really just a location. It's just showing you that there's two options. And sometimes there isn't two options. And then we call that perfect, for example. So I'm just going to go through it really methodically and show you this, right? So if I've got a C and I play another C on top of it, we call that perfect unison because it's the same note, right? Yay. Then I've got a half step higher, this note. And if I play these two things together, I've got a minor second, meaning it's the lowest option of my second, or that sort of position of a two. And then when I go one half step higher, I've got a major second. So just think of these as two options for this interval of a second, right? So it's just a way to kind of like help us get a little more specific, again, because of this whole physics thing that we talked about, where there's only so many ways that we can divide up these notes to reach an octave, right? So we have a minor second, right? Kind of sounds like a Jaws or something, right? So I sometimes give these little like sense memory things, like kind of a thing, right? That's maybe a throwback from like a little bit of an old movie, but I think we all have that somewhere in our minds. Major second is two of these half steps, and what I have is the higher version, a major second. Then I go to this one, which is a minor third, right? So lower option of my third and a major third, right? So that's the higher option. And they have certain sounds, right? Like we talk about major third sounding kind of like happy a little bit, right? And then This is sounding kind of like sad. And we'll talk about when we get to chords later. There's some really fun tricks about like the quality of it, like how does it make you feel, kind of a thing, so you can remember it that way too, in this more intuitive sense. So minor third, major third, sad, happy. And then we have a perfect fourth. Now that just, again, because these notes C and F are this particular distance away. So it's just actually like, think of it like a ruler or something. We're just measuring out the spaces between these notes so we know how many half steps they are away. So again, minor second, 1 half step, major second, 2 half steps, minor third, 3 half steps, major third, 4 half steps. Starts to get a little confusing, right? And this is why, like, if you're a guitar player and you're like, why is it that in order to play a fourth, I'm playing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 half steps away, or 5 frets away, right? It's because we have to keep track of all these other spaces so that we don't miss that there's that option of a note there. And so, these notes that I'm playing have been around since the beginning of this system and theory, and we've played them in all these different ways and orders, and they're always going to be the same notes if we keep this exact system, which is a very effective system. So it's just important to kind of note that it never really changes. So we've got the fourth again, and then this is what's funny. It's like, okay, then we have this new term, like a tritone. Like, why do we call it a tritone? There's this explanation of dividing up the octave, and the tritone is exactly in the middle. But back in the day, in classical music, people often sort of, at least they thought they were avoiding this interval a lot, and they just didn't like it in a certain context. So it just didn't really fit in their system. They didn't really talk about it in sort of the same way. So there's some limitations to these things. It's kind of like understanding like the stock market. Like, why do they call it that? Like, because of old like cattle trading terms and things like that don't really apply now to our digital era. But anyways, that's a tangent. But this whole concept of the tritone is really just the higher version of our fourth, right? So there's that note. And then we get to our perfect fifth. We'll also talk about why, based on sort of like basic understanding of chords and scales, why some of these notes have why that note in particular has a slightly different name. So again, now we have a perfect fifth going from C to G. So a quick shorthand that I'll do is count whatever note you're playing as 1. This often messes people up when they're trying to count intervals. If you go, okay, C to D, D to E, E to F, F to G, you're gonna be like, that's 4 away. And that's kind of true, but you have to think of every note as existing. And so C is our 1, right? And so if I go to C to D, 1, 2, D to E, 3, 4, 5. So C, D, E, F, G. It's just, trust me, that'll help you out a lot. And so you won't make those like that one step difference. It's like learning math and realizing that you're constantly missing one thing and then always getting a slightly wrong answer, which is really frustrating. But you just have to understand that every note exists. There's no zero note. There's no negative notes, right? This is just a placeholder to understand where each note is. So again, we've got C to G. We're at our fifth. And then we go to the next half step higher. We've got a minor sixth, the lower position of our sixth. A major sixth, the higher position of our sixth sort of slot or spot. And then we have a minor seventh, a major seventh, and then we are at the octave. So I am counting the sharps, actually. So I'm going, right now what I'm doing on the piano is I'm playing one note right to the next from C to C. So I am actually counting them, but I'm using major and minor as a way to keep track of them because of this one concept. And I'm really glad that you brought this up. It's like, why is it like this? Why are we explaining it this way? The best answer that I have for this is we have built music around a particular framework. It's all relative. So we need a basic template to work with. And it just so happens that we could think of the major scale or this pattern that we really liked. Back in the day, they had different terms for them. Um, and we use this as a basic template. So if you're looking at a piano, there's all the white notes are essentially, and there's more to this. Trust me, if you're like a music theory person, you're like, wait, well, is it really the major scale? We'll get there. We'll get there, right? Because the problem is you can go down a lot of rabbit holes because music theory is relative, and we have to have a template to ground ourselves first, and then you can get all wild about it. You can break rules. Remember, it's an art form too. So, the bane of theory's existence, right, is the fact that this is a creative art form, and so the theory should just serve our purpose of understanding what we're doing. So stuff that looks weird in music is weird. It sounds weird generally. And stuff that looks normal sounds a little bit more normal to our ear. So there's this, again, this context of why did we develop it this way? We want to know, like, well, if it doesn't, there's not a bunch of crazy symbols, it's something that is very common to everybody. And this has a little bit to do with paradigms, right? Which is this fancy term, right, for sort of collective knowledge in a certain system. And so we just have to kind of go with it. Like, this is the paradigm, and then you can break all the rules. Again, like, don't let me convince you that theory is a way to make everything like this sort of robotic formula. It's just a way to orient yourself, right? So that you can better communicate all the weird, cool, creative things that you're doing with music. Otherwise, you might get stuck actually doing the more common things because there's certain things that we gravitate towards just naturally, maybe because of our paradigms, because of the type of music that we listen to, right? It takes a really good artist sometimes to take us in a new direction and change the way that we think about things. But if you go down that rabbit hole before you understand music theory, you're running into this issue I talked about in the very beginning, which is learning a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and not understanding sort of the context, which leads to some holes in our understanding, right? And myself included. Like, I was always singing as a kid and doing things and playing chords on guitar. And, first I was just memorizing them. And then, eventually it's like, wait, why are we calling all these things with these certain terms? And there's like all these different terms that you're juggling. Trust me, it actually does all make sense. And this is really, really helpful. So the concept of why we're not counting the sharps and flats. Really, we're using major and minor as opposed to just giving them a different slot. Like, why don't we just go, here's 1 and here's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then repeat, right? Go from 1 to 12 and back, because that's actually how many half steps or how many notes that we actually have before we repeat the octave again. One, imagine a keyboard, and they have some of these. Imagine a keyboard with all just white notes or all black notes or just whatever color you want to give it. You might lose your place. And there are instruments like this, right? Like if you've ever played like an auto harp without the stops, with again, weird instrument. You can play these stops that play certain chords when you strum everything because it's muting certain notes. But if it's a chromatic auto harp, and you're not using any of that, you just have to know where every single one of them is. And trust me, it's hard to remember, and you're going to probably play wrong notes. So some of it is, again, so that we can play things and we can keep track of patterns. So if it all looks kind of symmetrical, that's really hard. Now, the second thing is it's designed around, let's just say, the major scale is a really great starting point. This is why a lot of music teachers start with major scale. The C major scale, because on the piano, that's all of our white notes, and it's a very particular pattern. All of those white notes are our cardinal letters. They are letters without sharps and flats. But physics and dividing strings up tells us that there are notes in between. And so we have to keep track of those. So that's why we use major and minor as these sort of higher and lower positions. You see, this actually kind of gets a little complex, but there is an answer for it. So hopefully that gives you a better sense of it. So if I'm playing from C to C, you'll notice, right, that if you're looking at a piano, or you can, use like an online keyboard just to see this visually, because it's nice to see. Again, sound waves are invisible; they're in our ear, and so having visual cues is really helpful. That's why piano is really helpful. Essentially, you'll see that there are black notes in between a lot of these spots, right? But then between 3 and 4, there's no black note, right? So it's just a half step there. And I'm talking about like between E and F. And B and C, same thing, right? There's no black note there. So it's designed with a particular template in mind. Um, why? Lots, you could be like a music historian and be like, because of the cultural evolution of certain theories being dominant or certain scales that people really liked in the Western culture or whatever, and it started, took over, and then that's why we have this basic template sort of set this way. There's this whole concept of modes and all these things that people did before they put all this theory together. So just think of it as, again, this messy process of trying to understand, like, some people are doing really cool things with these different instruments and lengths of strings and things, and with their voice, right, naturally. And I'm just trying to understand, like, why is everyone doing certain things a certain way and what's most common. So just like a language, right, we understand the common things first and then go to more complicated things so that we can communicate, right? So again, understanding it as a language, people always say this, right? It's like it's the universal language, and they're often talking from an emotional perspective. And it's actually more like thinking about it like functionally too, is, I think, really important, because, minor doesn't always sound sad. It's just like a nice way to remember it, right? Sometimes it can sound really cool and interesting. That doesn't sound like necessarily sad to me. So anyways, just important to kind of note. Um, it's just a way for us to keep track of these languages in a simple way. So that's intervals, right? We have to understand the distance between. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, just know that that's it. When I go from C to C, or any note to any note, there's only those 12 options, and they'll never change. They are just there. They're written into our instrument. They're built into our instruments. And if you're looking at sheet music, and you're just looking at the grand staff without any key signatures or anything like that, it's just these basic cardinal letters. It's just the letters without sharps and flats. So that's the next step, right? So we're actually making some pretty good headway. Notes, right? Naming notes with letters and sharps and flats. It's because it's a why sharps and flats, because of the next thing, right? Talking about intervals and all the distances between getting from one octave to the next octave, right? So those are our intervals when we're dealing with two notes and trying to get the distance between them, so that I can say to someone, I want you to play a perfect fifth or a minor sixth, starting from whatever note, C. Okay, minor sixth, and go, okay, I have those two notes and I can play them for you, right? Put that on a piece of paper, and you can tell someone to just read the piece of paper, and they'll be like, I see here a minor sixth. I play it. So that's that answer. So very methodical, right? You can just think of it as like this logical kind of system that we've created to serve a purpose of playing music that we like. Then we get to more complexity. So we have chords, right? I'll talk about scales in a second, but we've got chords, right? Chords you can think of as generally 3 or more notes. We can sometimes play 2 notes and kind of be sort of like outlining a chord, because we often, like, for example, if you're a music theory person, you can often leave out the fifth because our ear kind of fills it in a little bit. Just, again, sort of these interesting things about how our ear works and how our hearing is sort of designed around understanding certain things about pitches and overtones and things like that, and how you can train your ear to do that better and better. Essentially, like, you can do all sorts of fancy things with 2 notes and kind of make a chord. And just to understand that happens, right? If someone's playing a melody and just one other note at the same time, you can kind of like outline things if you're really careful about it. But generally, chords are 3 or more notes. Now we start to have a concept here. What if I play C, E, and G together, right? These 3 notes. Now here's where it gets a little confusing. And this is why I wanted to bring this up, because when I talk about major and minor, this is something that you kind of have to understand, or else you're going to get really confused with the terms. So if I go from C to E, you can see those black notes in between if you're looking at a keyboard. I've got what we call a major third, right? Ba, da, 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 da. So I've got minor second, major second, minor third, major third. They're just positions again, right? Now, if I go from E to G, this is also a third, but it's not a major third. It's actually a minor third. So if I go E, F, F sharp, G, and why is this the case? Because that's how many notes are there in between it, right? So again, built with the major scale in mind here. But from E to G, because I've got that half step there and I don't have that black note, I actually have a minor third. So when we're dealing with a major chord, like our typical major chord, which is C, E, and G here, our C major chord, we have a major third with a minor third stacked on top of it. So there's different ways that we can look at this chord, right? It's a bigger shape and a smaller shape. Now, from this note to this note, from C to G, is a fifth. But within that, because I have three notes, I can break it up into these two different sort of sides of the pie, right? A slightly bigger pie side, major third, and a minor third. We call that a major chord. And part of this is because we developed this understanding of major and minor as kind of like a way to organize our scales. And we'll get to this in a second. Famous scales that we like used to be called modes, and they had fancy terms like Ionian is the word for major, a major scale. And I'll talk about what a scale is and how it relates to chords, because these two things are kind of intricately connected, and that's where things get a little more complicated, right? So it's like one note, not so bad. Intervals, not so bad. When we add in this third variable, we start to get some more like kind of compounding complexity, right? And this is kind of the cool thing about music, right? As you keep adding in these variables, it just gets more and more complex and interesting. So don't forget that it starts with this simple foundation. The trick here, right, just like with science, is like understanding each individual small part and how it adds up to this really complex network that we may never fully understand, but we understand it enough to use it and communicate it in a language. So, so again, this concept is we used to have these weird sort of names for scales: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian. Your eyes start to kind of glaze back, right? Locrian, theoretical scale that people don't necessarily use that much. Maybe they do, right? But it's kind of tricky because it doesn't feel very natural. Anyways, we'll get there. Theory can kind of fill in some holes of some things that we never really did that much. At least, fight me on it. But it's people are like, Locrian doesn't even really exist. Anyways, well, that's for another time. But they had these scales, these kind of ways that people were singing and playing that they really liked, and they were kind of based off of different areas of geography, different cultures, and things like that. And what that is what's our option when we go from 1 to 8? Is we doing like, do I pick one of those major or minor options, right? Do I pick all the major options, or do I pick all the minor options, or do I pick some sort of mix between them? And then we get these famous scales, and this is where it gets a little confusing, and it's not perfect, right? The system isn't quite perfect, where we have like our two most kind of common scales, the major scale and the minor scale. Now, unfortunately, the minor scale doesn't use all the minor intervals. It uses a mix of those minor intervals. Just understand it's a context thing. Like there were these other modes, and you could think of some of these like fancier modes as like ultra minor or like extra lowered keys, right? Like Phrygian, for example, right? If you're a theory person, you're following me on that. If not, it'll make sense with time. So we just have to understand that we kind of simplified things at one point, and it leads to some confusion. So that's why we learn, as a music theory teacher or a music teacher, we teach people the major scale and the minor scale first, because they're the most common things that you're going to come across, and will get you the most bang for your buck. So when we understand the major scale, I go from C. I'm going to use C major because this is kind of, again, how it's the piano is designed in a way that this is really easy to understand from this context of C major. If I go from C to D, that's from a unison 1 to a major second, to a major third, to E, E to F is a fourth, F to G is a fifth, G to A is a major 6, A to B is a major 7, then back to the octave. So major is really easy to understand because it's all the higher options. It's the major options, except for that weird pesky tritone that people didn't like to use back in the day. So hopefully you're following me with this, but you can see that people just don't really explain all of this quite in this context, and that can lead to a lot of confusion. And then, if you're someone who's been around music for a while, you just kind of say these terms and people are like, what are you saying? Like, I don't understand. Like, I don't know even what you mean by a chord, right? And that's totally normal and that's totally fair if someone hasn't explained it to you, right? Um, so please ask me questions here. Again, if you're feeling a little lost by all of this, look at a keyboard. I think it's really, really helpful to understand this. Or you could look at sheet music too, right? That's another way to do this. And so to answer one of your questions, we're like, let's do an arpeggio warm up. What is an arpeggio? Arpeggio is a kind of a fancy term for moving up and down chord tones. So when I'm talking about this C major chord, C, E, G, E, C, it so happens too that these chords are every other letter, right? So our typical chords, it's C skipping D, D skipping D, right? Going to E, skipping F, going to G. And they look like these nice little stacked triads. That's why we call them that. So if I'm arpeggiating a chord, I'm just going from C to E to G, E, C. So it's kind of like a really fancy term for what we do with our basic music vocal exercises, right? Where I'm like, ma, 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 ma. There, I arpeggiated a chord, right? Really long-winded way of doing that. Or, as we do, I'm just like, try this with me, right? Like, ma, ma, ma. I don't even tell someone that it's an arpeggiation of a chord. Or I could go, ma, 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 ma. Also an arpeggiation of a chord. I'm just going C, E, G, back to C, and then back down, right? So ma, 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 ma. That's what's happening. And then often when we're dealing with vocal exercises, we're just doing the same thing with the entire chord up a half step. Ma, 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 ma. Ma, 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 ma. Right? And that makes sense because you're like, oh, it's getting incrementally higher and higher by one half step. But in order to do that as a teacher, you have to understand how to keep that shape the same and just move up everything up one half step at a time. And that does take some practice, right? Especially if you're doing it without looking at it like I'm doing, right? If I'm like, you have to get used to that. You can kind of feel it almost like it's like Braille with your fingers, right? Without actually looking at it. You can feel out what's one half step away. That's why our instruments are designed this way, to help us kind of streamline some of this process and keep track of everything. So that's why we have this sort of change of from black note to white notes, right? So we can have two sort of alternating things that can help us keep track of it. Again, if it were all just white notes, that exercise might be kind of easy, but some other things get really hard. So we have these basic scales, right? The major scale I went through. Now just know that the minor scale, it's a particular thing, and it's not just using all the minor intervals, and that's really frustrating. And take it up with, I don't know, whoever worked on this like hundreds of years ago. But we have this context, right? This Aeolian is actually a more specific way of thinking about the natural minor mode. And I'll just go through it here just so we have it in our context. But if I'm going from C to D, that's actually a major second. And then D to E flat, that's my minor third. So that's the difference between the major and the minor scale, is this note here. Instead of a major third, we have a minor third, but we also still have a major second. So that's confusing, it's frustrating. So C, D, E flat, then we go to the next slot. So we skip the major third slot, right? Because we're already doing the lower option, the minor third option. We go to 4, right, F, and then G. This is perfect fourth, perfect fifth. That was the way that they were trying to help us feel out that like these ones aren't involved, right? With there's the same between major and minor. Then we have a minor 6, right? It's that lower option. Minor 7 to the octave. So with this concept of understanding sharps and flats, understanding intervals, we can start to get a sense of these two different patterns that we can use. We can use a major scale or a minor scale. And the difference between them is three notes are different. Major thirds are minor thirds, major sixths are minor sixths, and major sevenths are minor sevenths. Just know that unfortunately there's also a major second in there. So that's kind of random, but again, that's it tough. That is the way that it is, because there's this other mode called Phrygian that goes like this, which is really pretty. It goes minor second, minor third, 4, 5, minor 6, minor 7, 8. It sounds like this. Right, and so that kind of, you might sound like a little Spanish to you, or like, there's some Arabic scales that sound similar to this too, or pretty close and have a couple other changes and things like that. Again, they're just like, what options do I do as I go from 1 to 8? And I can pick, and if I have different options, it's a different scale. So what are scales? Why are we doing this? Scales are our melodies. It's a way to think about like the horizontal dimension. And we'll get, it's more complicated, but this is a good way to sort of frame it. Like as a vocalist, we're singing often the melody. We don't have to, right? We could be in an a cappella group or something and sing harmonies, sing in a choir. But generally, we're the melody, we think of these scale degrees. Now, when we're in the context of like understanding how we do shorthand teaching for like pitch matching and things like that, in this context of like the way that we teach with, Camille and I do this with the 30-day singer stuff, is we give these scales numbers as well. And the reason that we do that is because we're assuming that we've heard this major scale and this minor scale a lot. And if I just say we're singing the major scale, I can then just say, okay, I know it's going to be these major slots, and I'm going to go from 1 to 8. So I can go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, because it's an easier shorthand. If I know a song is just going to be like that, I give it numbers because I can do it better, rather than like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, do. Solfege, right? That's a whole other system that people can use. It helps vocalists. That's why we often use that, because the vowel shapes feel like brighter or more open for different positions, and it helps us kind of sing in tune a little bit. But it's kind of like a few steps removed, and you kind of have to learn this whole other system. So most of us know how to use numbers going from 1 to 8 and back. And so that's a really easy shorthand to get people into just singing the major scale and feeling what it's like, right? Da 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 da. Right? That's the major scale. I don't have to give it labels. I can just be like, sing this with me, and you'll start to get the hang of it. Same thing with minor, right? I can be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If I know it's minor, I know it's this particular pattern, right? Of major second, minor third, fourth, fifth, minor 6, minor 7, 8. And then you start to memorize that feeling of da 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 na 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 na. And that's really this context, right? So those are our scales. Now we get to this next step, and we're making good progress here. I know there's more that we can talk about, but whenever we're playing music, we have a melody, sometimes just a melody, right? Sometimes someone's just singing, and that's beautiful. If we have something accompanying us underneath us, like an instrument, which is helpful and it makes for some more complexity, then we have chords happening, right? We have multiple notes on top, or at least intervals at the very least, right? And we talked about, right, sometimes we can, like, with just a few notes, kind of hear the outline of some chords. But we have accompaniment, right? We have harmony underneath our melody. or above it if you're singing a vocal harmony. But just think of it like that, right? We have a melody when we're playing music, and we have chords or we have harmony that's happening. So some playing piano and singing ya da da ba da 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 ya ba 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 da 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 ba ba. I'm singing scale degrees in major and playing chords that also fit with that scale. So that's kind of in its basic sort of sense of understanding. We need a melody and we need harmony underneath it. Now, you might be like, okay, so how do I do chords? There are all the notes in my scale. If you're thinking of simple things, like if I'm playing in the key of C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, these are the notes that I have. This is the material I have to work with. In simple music, we can start to mix and match and do all sorts of cool things. That's like theory 2.0, right? We're doing theory 101 here, so I'm not going to go into theory 2 yet. But essentially, I'm just playing chords that are with those scale degrees. So they will always fit. And then we have this concept of chord progressions, which chords kind of move nicely from one to the next. We get to another thing. So if you know, like, I know I'm not technically teaching voice skills for 30 Day Singer, but I think this helps us become a better vocalist. But you know what you can do is on a piano, do a really simple practice. You can take your thumb, your middle finger, and your pinky, and if you find where C is, and you just play your thumb, your middle finger, and your pinky, C, E, G, that's our one chord. It starts with C is our one. Now I can just take that shape and just go up one white note with each finger, and I'll play all the chords that you can find in the key of C. So it demystifies some things, right? I think just when we have all these variables floating around in our brain, it becomes this like kaleidoscopic mess, and then you're just so dizzy and disoriented, right? So you can literally just go like this. Here's my one chord. Now I'm going to move every single one up one note at the same time. Here's my 2 chord D minor. Here's my 3 chord E minor. Here's my 4 chord F major. Here's my 5 chord G major. Here's my 6 chord A minor. And then we get a really weird chord, B diminished, back to C. So we'll get to this in a second. But you can see mainly it's just kind of alternating between major and minor chords, again, with that major scale. These are all the chords that I can play in the key of C major. And then it's just a matter of like, well, which ones do I want to play first? Do I want to go, okay, here's my 1 chord, and then here's my 6 chord, and then here's my 4 chord and my 5 chord, and then you have like a 50s doo-wop, right? Like, and then you could sing on top of that, right? So a lot of our like contemporary songs, you know, in their basic sense, it's just doing this, singing a scale with a basic chord progression of like often 4 chords, and they change the order of them sometimes, and that's actually really what's happening. And then all we have to do on top of that is talk about rhythm, right? So we're getting there, right? And I'm not talking about like key signatures yet. That'll be for theory 2, which I'll probably do in a couple months from now, just so we cover some other topics. And then we'll talk about keys and other things. But this is like getting the lay of the land, and hopefully it's just starting to like clear out the sort of chaos of what's going on here. So what do we need? We need melody using scales, right? Which involves intervals and notes, right? Then we need to deal with accompaniment. Sometimes you have someone do this for you, or you can get a track, right? But these are the chords that go underneath that as you're singing. So think of it as that vertical dimension, right? So it's like if I'm singing a melody, da 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 da, horizontal dimension through time, right? And then at any given moment, I'm playing that da da da. So I'm playing all these notes at the same time. That's making my chord. Da ba 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 ba. Right, I can do the same kind of patterns over and over again. It starts to sound interesting because I have chords underneath that are changing. And then we need rhythm, right? Which is just telling us, when do I play these notes? At what time? And we have patterns for this. We have a way of thinking about common time. So what's most common? Common time, also known as 4/4, means that we are organizing 4 beats at a time. So ba 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 da. Or maybe I'll do something simpler like da 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 da. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just like the same thing with understanding pitches. We have to group things together. Otherwise, I don't want to like, okay, I'm counting to 127. And then it's like, where am I again? So we're grouping them so that we can at least get a sense of a small bit at a time and where, when I'm playing things. It also has to do a little bit with the emphasis and other things like that. Um, but it's essentially just a way for us to process bits of information at a time and keep track of them. So I can be like, is it on the first beat, the second beat, the third beat, or the fourth beat? So I might be like this. Okay, I'm going to play a chord and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And after 4 beats, one measure, I'm going to change chords, right? You see, so this is just helping me understand when do I do stuff, right? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, and change it. 1, 2, 3, 4, and change it. 1, 2, 3, 4, and change it. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's a way that we can coordinate our melody with our harmony so that they happen at the right time. And there's this funny quote that music teachers will say sometimes: the right note at the wrong time is still a wrong note, right? And that's kind of the thing. We want these things to land at the right time together so that they work. Otherwise, if I'm like doing, certain things and it's you lands at a weird chord, you might just get like a weird harmony that you're not expecting, right? So hopefully you start to get a sense of this, right? Like we need a melody, we need a harmony, we need it to be happening at the right time, our rhythm. And then from there, those are kind of like the essential tools that you need to put something together. And then we just get to like what they call song form. And song form is just like a verse versus a pre-chorus versus a chorus, or like an A section and then a B section, right? Again, here come letters again. Yay, we're using the same symbols over and over again in different ways. That's frustrating, but that's exactly why this is what happens and it's why it's confusing. But we're essentially trying to get a sense of, okay, like all these words and this similar melody is repeating, and that's one section, and there's certain chords, and then I get to the next section and the chords change or the melody changes and things like that. So it's just helping us keep track of larger bits of material. And then you start to realize there's certain kinds of song forms. There's like verse refrain, like where you actually like often start with a little tag and then you go into a explanation and verses and then you do the tag again and you keep coming back to that tag, and that's like verse refrain. There's also just like songs that are just verse 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 verse, and they're often like folk songs or like a Bob Dylan thing or something like that. And then we have our typical song form that we have, right, which is verse, sometimes pre-chorus, and then chorus. And so it's like this big setup for the like slam dunk basket, right? We like explain things, we escalate a little bit, and we add some new chords, and then we come to this big sort of revelation in our chorus. And then sometimes I'm using more emotional language, but it's just essentially, playing with these variables of melody, chords, chord progression, and rhythm. And when you start to mix and match those in the right sort of way, we start to create like motion and something that we can express ourselves on top of. But again, the language is just to be like, I'm a musician, I'm showing up. Okay, what chords do you want me to play? Give me some music, and I can see if it's really detailed and specific, like then I can do it because you've notated it all out. Or I could use a lead sheet, which just says like, play this chord with this word, and you can come up with the rest, right, and figure it out and improvise, which is what we get a lot with contemporary music. Play the chords. Okay, what's the melody? Okay, I need to figure out the right scale degrees and figure out when they happen with which word. Do that, or write it out, right? That's the best way because that's super fast in certain situations. And then I've got to play them together at the same time, or make sure that I'm matching my scale degrees with whoever's playing the chords so that we can do them at the same time. And then we construct a thing, right? Like with song form, we construct sort of a journey that we take people on. So again, the whole point of theory is to help make things easier. And yes, then we get some weird terms about like tempo and different kinds, if you're in classical music, like what are all the different sort of terms mean? And then dynamics and all these other things, right? And so we just keep adding layers from there. But that's like the meat of it. And then everything else is sort of extra layers on top, right? What's a retardando? It means like slow down, or a accelerando means speed up as you go, right? The tempo is changing, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these terms. If you have, I have a few minutes, but if you have any questions, ask them now. And of course, I'll come back. I always cycle through this and continue to sort of add layers to it. So we'll do a 2.0 at some point and talk about like key signatures and some maybe go a little deeper into what the modes are and things like that. But if you understand these sort of systems and how they work together, then you can play music. That's really it. And you don't have to do all of it yourself too, right? Like you can learn just how to sing the melody, and then someone else can play the chords, right? If it's a song that's already written too, like get that information. Oftentimes, right, when I'm working with a student, like for contemporary music, I'll look up a lead sheet, find resources, sometimes sheet music if it's really particular. It's like classical music or musical theater or something like that. Um, and then I start to figure out the chords and the key signature and stuff like that. That's just like where am I playing my scale on what note, right? We'll get to that. There's more in that. And then essentially I'm teaching them, okay, so what are the scale degrees of your melody? And we start to learn that. And we often have to do it by ear for contemporary music, because I'll tell you, like, what it's kind of like written, like, okay, think of it like this. Like a lot of contemporary pop musicians are not writing out their sheet music like they used to. They're not like notating it like a classical musician. And so we have to kind of follow in a similar way. It sort of like takes more effort to have it written out for you, and you can do that, but often it looks a little inorganic compared to sort of the process of how someone actually sang it. Like, yes, you can do it correctly, but then sometimes when people are reading that like perfectly, it kind of sounds like weirdly like robotic and like not pop or contemporary really. So there's just like some frustrations of like, there's a lot of like shorthand happening with the contemporary scene, and we're using more like lead sheets and stuff. So we have to learn things by ear. So sometimes you'll get like a really great pop musician who can harmonize, who can learn a melody really quickly, but they don't read music. And it's not like, I like to say that there's a lot of skills happening there. There's tonal memory. There's understanding things in like a sort of more physical sense of, I don't know why it sounds good, but I can always find that right kind of harmony because patterns repeat themselves in music. And that person has learned by feeling a lot more, and a couple terms here and there. And that's still great. Like you can be like a great professional, famous musician and do that. And it doesn't mean that like you're lacking necessarily. But, there's the other side of it is like reading music, and it's a different context. So just understand that we pick pieces of theory that we need that best serve us. And as vocalists, if you're just a vocalist, you're often mainly dealing with just the melody, right? And then sometimes harmony, which has some particular patterns, and we go over this. But yeah, hopefully, again, this is just giving you, again, a framework for like what's happening, because there's so many other things to think about, like how do I use my voice, and like how do I avoid cracking, and all these terms, and like head voice and chest voice and stuff. And we often just don't take the time to explain, like, oh yeah, by the way, here are the rules of the game if you want to play. And it really actually doesn't take as long as you might think. It does take a long time if you're trying to do it like from the very traditional sense of like learning like classical piano or something like that, right? Like as like if you're going to be a concert pianist, there's a slow and sort of steady process of understanding all the symbols. But a lot of times we don't got time for that, right? And so we kind of think of the application. And so as a teacher, sometimes we're just throwing people to what's most rewarding first, right? Getting you into the flow, getting you inspired, and then kind of like filling in the holes later. So just know that there's like a plethora of terms and things and a context for all of these terms, and they're sometimes particular to like specific music and specific cultures, and there's like a different language for it. Know that like if you're, from the jazz world, like you're thinking about things differently sometimes. Like when we deal with chords, sometimes we continue to stack it past the octave. Like we think of ninths or 11ths or 13ths. And it's just like, a nine is really just 1, 3, 5, 8, 9. You could think of that as two, right? In certain contexts. So there's like different dialects and things like that. So, da, and if you're actually like thinking in jazz, then often a nine chord means like a dominant chord too. And it sounds like that. So there's just these particular contexts that you have to learn. And that's why sometimes if you're trying to do a particular style, it's good to have a musician who understands that particular dialect. It's like, I want to learn this uh, particular way of singing this language, right? And so there's sometimes slightly different terms, and there's crossover, but they can sometimes frustrate people. So the difference is like C add 9 or C9. And one tells you that you need to add a particular note in there, and the other one tells you you need to add two particular notes in there, right? And how would you know unless you just know the context of like that, the jazz sort of voicing, so to speak, right? So just know that there's all sorts of little subspecialties, things like that, and you can learn that from a teacher in particular context. But the most important thing is to understand naming notes, naming intervals, two notes, understanding how three chords or three notes make a chord, and there's intervals with that. You can name all three notes. You can figure out the interval between these two, or you can figure out the intervals between these two, or the interval between these two. So there's three different intervals, right, that help you understand that chord, and then you put it all together in a rhythm and make a song. So I encourage you, like, try making a little song, right? Find four chords in C major. You can look this kind of stuff up. Sing a melody in C major, and you can come up with something really, really amazing. There are great songs that are just like that. Maybe it's too high or too low in C major, and you can just do it in a different key, but it's the same relationships. And so that's the sneak peek at sort of Theory 2.0 that we'll talk about again in a few months. I didn't put it right afterwards because I think it's nice to kind of rotate some things. So sit with that for a bit, and then yeah, perhaps like sometime in the summer we'll do like what's next and how do we get to sort of the next level. But yeah, I find this stuff to be actually really, really fascinating and fun. And there's all sorts of angles to approach it. You can think of it highly technical, or you can also just like feel it out like people did back in the day. And theory again was invented as a way to understand what people were doing, right? Because we have this sort of beautiful, intuitive sense of sound, and it's ultimately what sounds good to you, right? You could do things theoretically, and they sound all right, that's cool. That's like it works by theory, but you're going to miss the sort of emotional aspect of taking risks, putting some weird sounds to things, right? And I get all the time people are like, what is this? Why is that? Why does it sound like that? And I could tell you based on theory, but like you ultimately discovered that, and you don't have to be like a trained theorist, like a composer necessarily. I mean, I'm not hating on that, because it's a really great thing to know and know how to do, but you don't have to go through years and years of education to write a song. So hopefully that just kind of gives you some confidence, inspires you to explore a little bit more, and see what you come up with. So again, thanks for listening and following me through the crazy music theory lesson. But I really hope that this will just help kind of demystify some things for people, because I had to go through a phase where I did this. I was understanding it from a higher level, even like going through school and stuff. And then when I had to explain it to someone for the first time as a teacher, that's when I was like, wait, like I never really like stopped and just thought about it really methodically like this. So that's just what I wanted to share with y'all. And I'll see you guys next week, and we'll be on to the next topic. So take care, everyone. And as always, have a great day or evening or wherever and whenever you're tuning into this. So take care, everyone, and I'll see you next time.